In recent weeks, Russian forces have bombarded Ukraine. Over 200,000 troops have invaded the country. Indiscriminate violence has rained down on Ukrainian cities and villages, making little distinction between military targets and civilians, innocent men, women, and children.
It's hard to wrap your head around the scale of destruction where people were living just normal lives, now utterly destroyed.
Cities have been reduced to rubble. Millions of refugees have crossed European borders. Threats of nuclear annihilation have been made. A sovereign nation of over 44 million people is under attack.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
How did we get here? With hindsight, it is clear that this war is the logical endpoint of 20 years of rule by one man, President Vladimir Putin. To begin to understand Putin, his worldview, aggression, suppression of critics, assault on Western democracies, his influence, his legacy, we can start with the source himself.
Проявили слабость, а слабых бьют.
Europe's largest invasion since World War II is the result of Vladimir Putin's dominance of Russian politics in the 21st century. A reminder that grievance-based ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism leads inexorably to conflict. This was on display as Putin launched a war despite disapproval from the global community and despite clear misgivings among many Russians around him, including the oligarchs whose wealth he has facilitated and benefited from. This was unmistakably Putin's call and Putin's war.
Создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
But Putin clearly underestimated the resistance he'd face. Led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian resistance fighting has been fierce and captured for the world to see by press and on platforms like TikTok and Twitter. Videos from the ground in Ukraine have flooded social media, galvanizing the world and disrupting some of Putin's own disinformation campaigns. Also fierce?
Putin is now isolated from the world more than he has ever been.
The response from world leaders.
Together, along with our allies, we are right now enforcing powerful economic sanctions.
Despite unprecedented sanctions, which have pummeled the Russian economy, frozen hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth, and largely cut Russia off from trade with the West, Putin has held steadfast. That's because the stakes for Putin aren't just winning or losing a battle. He's invested the credibility of his entire regime in this war. Backing down could cost him everything. Putin's story begins in the late 80s, when he was a KGB officer in Soviet-dominated East Germany when the Berlin Wall fell and democracy washed across Germany and Eastern Europe. This led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Now, 14 republics, including Ukraine, were independent nations, separated from Russia. Putin suffered, watching the empire and ideology he served collapse, opening a wound of humiliation that would never heal. Instead, he embraced a blood and soil nationalism that saw Russian speakers left beyond Russian borders as unnaturally separated from Russia.
И об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века.
In the 1990s, Putin entered politics, serving as a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, as Russia's president, Boris Yeltsin, oversaw the rapid democratization and privatization of Russia. It was a time of hope and rampant corruption. Russian oligarchs took control of the economy, while the majority of the Russian people suffered, and Putin would both capitalize on that corruption politically and personally. Putin left St. Petersburg and served in a number of roles in Yeltsin's administration, and ultimately became prime minister in 1999. As he rose up through the ranks, he also built up his influence in a network of cronies, largely men, like him, from Russia's security services. In 1999, a series of deadly bombings in Russia were attributed to Muslim militants from Chechnya, a breakaway region within Russia's borders. though for years, allegations have persisted that the bombings were actually a false flag operation, the work of Russia's FSB, the successor to the KGB. In response, Putin took the lead in launching a brutal offensive in Chechnya. The capital city of Grozny was leveled in scenes that anticipated the destruction in Ukraine today. But the war introduced him to the Russian public as a strong man and strong nationalist. His popularity soared. On December 31st, 1999, Yeltsin announced that he was stepping down as president, naming Putin as his successor. As an incumbent, he'd win the 2000 presidential election with ease. In less than a decade in politics, Putin soared to Russia's most powerful position. Putin had the support of the intelligence services and oligarchs, but many Russians also saw his grim, workmanlike demeanor as a welcome change from the chaotic Yeltsin years. Perhaps a gray KGB man could restore order. And for a time, that's what happened. He benefited from a mix of luck and timing. The price of oil skyrocketed, which stabilized the economy. In those early years, geopolitical circumstances also painted Putin in a flattering light. For example, there were sparks when President George W. Bush first met Putin in 2001.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
But Putin's tone changed, as the framework of a global war on terror suited his more autocratic instincts. In 2004, a group of heavily armed Chechen militants held over 1,000 hostages, including nearly 800 children, in a Russian school in Beslan. 2 days later, Russian security forces stormed the school. Nearly 200 children died. When Putin gave a speech in Beslan, he didn't just respond to the tragedy, he used it as an opportunity to outline his worldview and political program.
Сегодня мы живем в условиях, сложившихся после распада огромного, великого государства. Наша страна с некогда самой мощной системой защиты своих внешних рубежей в одночасье оказалась незащищенной ни с запада, ни с востока.
Putin wasn't just talking about Chechnya. The threat was from the West, from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a Cold War-era institution built to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. NATO had since expanded by admitting Eastern European nations and former Soviet republics. The Western American-led military alliance was now on Russia's borders. In response to these alleged threats to Russia from within and without, Putin moved to execute a, quote, complex of measures aimed at strengthening the unity of the country. In short, he accelerated his turn to a more authoritarian Russia. Elections of governors were canceled so they could be handpicked by the Kremlin. Parliamentary elections were rigged to favor his party, United Russia. New laws cracked down on foreign-funded NGOs. Harassment of journalists and political opponents intensified. And Russian media crafted a cult of personality around Putin. In the spring of 2008, Putin's presidential term ended. Though Putin retreated into the position of prime minister, no one questioned the real power behind the Kremlin. That same spring, the Bush administration took a provocative step to Putin by offering a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO, two more former Soviet republics that border Russia.
This is the first time when it was clearly determined that Ukraine will be in NATO. This is a historic event for our people and our country.
By that fall, Russia had invaded Georgia, occupying 2 provinces of the country, which it continues to hold to this day. The message wasn't subtle. Russia believed it had a sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union, and it wanted the West to back off. Then the global economy collapsed, oil prices plummeted, and along with it, Russia's revenues. After the financial crisis and election of Barack Obama, Russia tended to its wounds and pursued a more pragmatic foreign policy for a time. Putin's second act as president began in 2011. He appeared with President Medvedev to announce that Putin, not Medvedev, would run for president in 2012. That had been the plan all along, they said. The Russian people, stung by the economic crisis and outraged by Putin's announcement, showed stirrings of opposition. Protests erupted in Moscow, championed by long-standing opposition leaders like Boris Nemtsov and the anti-corruption crusader Alexei Navalny. When Putin took back the presidency in 2012, he cracked down on threats to his rule. NGOs were shut down. Nationalism was dialed up. The LGBTQ community was stigmatized. The political opposition faced increased threats and harassment. A massive machinery of propaganda and disinformation celebrated Putin and demonized his opponents on television and, increasingly, online. In 2015, Boris Nemtsov was assassinated on a bridge just across from the Kremlin. Alexei Navalny was detained and poisoned while in prison. When I talked to him for my book in 2020, he told me, "It's a strange message, how they poison people in Russia. They think that they can poison you, and maybe they can control you." Navalny refused to back down, building a nationwide organization and making films exposing the rampant corruption and kleptocracy that Putin led. Shortly after I spoke with Navalny, he was poisoned again, nearly died, and was thrown in prison, where he remains to this day. As Putin was becoming more autocratic at home, he was also even more aggressive abroad. Which brings us back to Ukraine. First, we need to rewind a little. In 2004 and 2005, Ukraine's pro-democracy Orange Revolution protests broke out against the rigged presidential election of the Russian-backed candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. The protests succeeded, and the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was elected. A color revolution, a spontaneous uprising for democracy. That's Putin's biggest fear at home. He relentlessly casts these revolutions as the work of the West, especially when they consume former Soviet republics. By 2010, the pro-democracy political movement in Ukraine was ruptured by division. Yanukovych was returned to power and hit the brakes on Ukraine's potential Western partnerships. He ended Ukraine's pursuit of NATO membership, and in 2013, he blocked Ukraine's free trade agreement with the European Union, signaling, instead, an interest in deepening ties with Moscow. Ukrainians' disgust with corruption and desire for democracy and closer ties with the West led to another wave of protests in Kyiv, the so-called Revolution of Dignity. Yanukovych's security forces opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing dozens, but the protests continued. In February of 2014, Yanukovych fled Ukraine to Russia, and pro-Western politicians were poised to sweep to power. This meant Ukraine, the most populous former Soviet republic that shares a 1,500-mile border with Russia, was poised to drift away from Russian influence. Putin acted quickly. Thousands of Russian special forces moved into Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula with a Russian naval facility and Russian-speaking majority, and annexed the territory. Putin tried to repeat a similar play in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbas, backing so-called separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk. Putin didn't advance further into Ukraine than Donbas, but he also didn't leave the lands he just occupied. Russian weapons and military personnel poured in to support the separatists. Throughout his attacks in Ukraine, Putin ramped up both cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. This included Putin's influence operation on America's 2016 election, hacking and releasing Democratic emails, targeting American swing states with conspiracy theories on Facebook, or amplifying white supremacy. And we all know how that worked out. For 4 years, Putin had a useful idiot and fellow nationalist in the Oval Office, one who, according to his own former aides, wanted to leave NATO. Donald Trump's presidency was a gift to Putin, and it was a good time to be an authoritarian. Trump trashed NATO, sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies, and leaned on Ukraine's President Zelensky to dig up dirt on his political opponents. Back in Ukraine, the friction between the public and Putin grew. After 2014, the Ukrainian people turned harder against Russia because of the annexation of Crimea and invasion of the Donbas. Support for joining NATO grew, even as Ukraine's government was still vulnerable to Russian influence without stronger American backing. But then, in 2020, Trump lost to a NATO loyalist.
Putin's latest attack on Ukraine was premeditated and totally unprovoked. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond. He thought he could divide us at home, in this chamber, in this nation. He thought he could divide us in Europe as well. But Putin was wrong.
Over the last year, Putin steadily built up the military presence surrounding Ukraine. He intervened to support autocrats facing popular protests in the former Soviet republics of Belarus and Kazakhstan. He's also cultivated an anti-democracy, anti-West partnership with the only other autocrat whose power eclipses his own, China's Xi Jinping. Back home, Putin liquidated Alexei Navalny's political organization and the remaining civil society organizations in Russia. He also ramped up his propaganda machine, casting Ukrainians as Nazis and asserting Russia's historic claim on Ukraine as a country. Putin is determined to reconstitute a version of the old Russian Empire, wrapped in phony justifications. And even as thousands of Russians are killed and many more Ukrainians are massacred, he has made any peaceful protest or honest coverage of the war a criminal offense. So the war in Ukraine can be seen as the logical endpoint of the last 30 years of Vladimir Putin's life. From the humiliation he felt as a young KGB officer, to the corrupt kleptocracy and autocracy he built in Russia, to his efforts to undo NATO's expansion and the loss of Russian domination over former Soviet republics. Put simply, he does not want democracy or NATO on his border. He wants to be seen as the leader who restored Russian greatness and the Russian Empire. He also wants to die in his bed, a very rich man. Ukraine is central to all of those projects, symbolically and physically.
Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией. Имеющаяся у нас информация дает все основания полагать, что вступление Украины в НАТО и последующее развертывание здесь объектов Североатлантического альянса – вопрос предрешенный. Это дело времени.
That's why we're at this moment. It's also why Putin's scheme has been messy, to say the least. This time, it appears, Putin has miscalculated badly.
This much is already clear. Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin. Putin may be able to take a city, but he'll never be able to hold the country.
The democratic world stands united against Putin and has poured in arms and assistance to Ukraine, which refuses to back down. President Zelensky has stood up to a bully and led his country by example, staying to fight and vocally defying Putin on social media and some of the world's biggest platforms. In doing so, he's tapped into a populism not of grievance-based nationalism, but of idealism and community.
Мы боремося за наші права, свободу, за життя. А зараз ми боремося за виживання.
Zelensky connected the thread from Ukraine's fight for freedom to the world's struggle for democracy. That if Putin came for one democratic nation, he would not just stop there. His emotional appeal, alongside the incredible acts of bravery and resistance from the Ukrainian people, have moved global powers to act faster and fiercer than anyone could have predicted, especially Putin. Now, the Russian people themselves cannot escape the consequences. From the oligarchs losing their wealth, to ordinary people devastated by sanctions, to Russian soldiers who are fighting and dying in Ukraine for a lie. We don't know how this will end, but neither does Putin. What we do know is that he has unleashed kleptocracy, autocracy, and now carnage in Europe that will forever change the world order and the lives of millions of people.